What is sexual harassment? Looking into the definition, according to research and theory, it is being subjected to unwelcome behavior that is sexual in nature. Sexual harassment is any form of unwanted sexual advance, and it can include physical, verbal, and non-verbal behavior. Now let's look into the scope of these behaviors. Sexual harassment can range from offensive gestures to the actual rape or sexual assault. Now let's look into the levels of sexual harassment. Level 1, gender harassment. What is it? This refers to verbal remarks that are sexual in nature, and remember, in this level, there are no touching behaviors. For example, one can be told of suggestive stories of rude, sexist remarks. Level 2, seductive behavior. This includes inappropriate sexual advances, such as attempts at discussing a person's sexual life when they are clearly not willing to, and when they are not consenting to the topic. Level 4, sexual coercion. An individual is coerced into a sexual activity by threats of punishment. Let's say you have a job and you have a boss who makes sexual advances, and maybe there might be some kind of reprimand if you don't comply to the act. Or you might be part of a social club in which an instructor or a coach make these unwanted advances, and if you don't comply, you may be threatened with punishment. The last level, sexual assault or rape. This includes forceful attempts to grab someone, touch, fondle, and even kissing. This may include exhibitionism, such as the flashing of private parts to a non-consenting individual. Also, and lastly, and the most serious, the attempted rape or the actual rape where the person gets assaulted. Now let's look into common reactions to sexual harassment. Like what happens if you're confronted with the situation. People may experience confusion stemming from sexual advances. Sometimes that may involve self-blame or self-doubt, because you as an individual, you may start blaming yourself of the act or having self-doubt if actually you have warranted the act or not. One of the reactions is fear, because you'll be fearing of the consequences, like what would happen to your job, what would happen to your status at work, what would happen to you as a student, would you lose marks, etc. And also this involves anxiety and depression, sometimes anger, because this arouses the whole scenario of what will happen to me if I report it to the authorities. So that situation may really induce some form of stress, anxiety. Lastly, one of reactions is disillusionment, which involves start questioning your status as an employee, subordinate, superior, a student, or a role in your job or in a social club. This involves a number of questions, because when you confront it, you wouldn't know what you should do sometimes, because this includes fear, anxiety, and depression. What are some of the barriers to reporting sexual harassment? People may not report the incident because of fear of retribution, such as the revenge from the accused or the alleged perpetrator in response to the complaint. Also not being believed, because they may fear that if I report this to the authorities, they might not believe my story. Stigmatization, because the stigma attached to the whole incident, it's embarrassing, it's humiliating, and people may not want to come forward. Also, people may fear further victimization, because they may feel like they will be further victimized by the questions if they report this to the authorities. Now, what is our responsibility as healthcare professionals? First of all, it is good that there's awareness about the incidents, the support, especially for the complainants, also challenging of the evidence and the stereotypes, also educating the public, educating the community, educating the perpetrator, and also the people who come forward alleging these crimes. Alright, now let's look into the differences between flirting and harassment. because some people may confuse the two. Actually, you may be harassing someone, whereas you think in your mind that you are flirting with the person. So it's very important to distinguish between the two. Let's look into some of the aspects or some of the features of flirting and some of the aspects and features of harassment. Flirting. Flirting feels good for both individuals, whereas sexual harassment, you feel bad. Flirting is attractive, whereas sexual harassment is degrading. Flirting, there's equality because each individual share the same sentiments, feelings, whereas sexual harassment is power-based. One individual is dominating and is exercising power over another individual. Flirting, it's equality because both individuals share the same feelings and sentiments, whereas sexual harassment, there's a power struggle because one individual is dominating and is exerting the power over another individual. Flirting is legal, whereas sexual harassment is illegal because there are consequences. Flirting is open because both individuals, they share information, they agree to their behaviors, they both feel good about it, whereas sexual harassment is very invasive because it also intrudes on your privacy. Flirting is affirming, whereas sexual harassment is humiliating, objectifying of an individual. Now let's talk about procedures. What should you take, what should you do as an individual if you're confronted with the situation? First of all, you need to tell the harasser to stop, and you must do this firmly and assertively because it's very important that the perpetrator gets the message. Now, there are certain steps or things you need to take into consideration if you're confronted with this situation, such as, number one, you should keep all the records of the incidents of sexual harassment. Number two, you need to describe the incidents or the events. It's very important because should this be taken to the disciplinary hearing or to the court of law, you may need to keep your records describing the evidence, describing the events. Type of behaviors, also the dates, times, and places. And if there are any witnesses, you may also need to include that in your report. And you must remember, this should be kept strictly confidential because it's a very sensitive information and it might end up in a court of law. Lastly, on procedures, remember, it is very important to keep the evidence. For example, notes left by the harasser. Also seek advice and support. In the context of University of Johannesburg, we have a legal clinic. We also have psych-ed in which they can advise further what steps you should take if you're confronted with this situation. Now let's look into some considerations. Although you should know there's no absolute protection for sexual harassment, but there's some precautions you can take into consideration as an individual confronted with the situation. First of all, you should avoid working alone at night, especially if you know that you live in an environment where it's not really safe. Number two, you should be very vigilant with your surroundings or confrontations. If you're confronted, you should be vigilant and be very assertive, especially in unsafe situations. Also, you must remember to communicate clearly, especially if there's unwanted sexual advances. So the person who pursues or who harasses, they should know firmly and assertively that you don't like or they must stop the behavior. Now, why is it important for you to talk about this and not keep silent about sexual harassment? It's very important because, first of all, you are raising awareness about the incidents, and reporting, it may actually bring about closure and healing. And remember, talking about it also is a form of talk therapy, because when you talk, actually, you begin the process of healing. Lastly, this is a question you need to ask yourself. Do you think you could be harassing someone? So these are some of the questions you can ask yourself before you act, if you are not sure. such as, would I engage in this behavior if other people were present? Would I want someone that you care about to know about this? Number 3, would I want this behavior to be made public? If you have answered yes in all of those questions, then you might be guilty of sexual harassment without knowing actually you've been acting in that manner.